How are you?
I'm good.
You good?
Just realized I forgot to make a cup of coffee.
Well, you just finished a cup of coffee, so I think you'll be okay. I think our subject today should be either relatively easy to deal with or so vaguely all over the place that we're going to be here for the next 2 hours.
I mean, the cool thing is about the subject is it's probably easy to deal with. You, however, on the other hand,
Fair. That's fair.
yeah.
Not gonna disagree with that. Here's a question: what's the best not whole food meal you've had recently?
Not whole food meal?
Yeah, like the something that you ate and you're like, yeah, that's probably not good, but it was really good.
So last night, because it's a basketball game, I smoked wings, which that was, it's real chicken, real spices. That was not a problem. The chips and dip, however, that went with it. Probably the dip is probably, 4 different kinds of dip. We went all out on the dip. That was kind of like a charcuterie board with dip instead of cheese and meat.
Nothing wrong with that.
We had French onion, which is your standard. We had jalapeno cheddar, which is, I wasn't a fan. We had fried pickle dip.
Yeah.
Which is pretty good. I mean, I don't know if you know Dean's. If you're in the South, Dean's Dairy has come out with sports bar dips. One of them is Nashville Hot. It's pretty good. One of them is fried dill pickle. Pretty good. One of them is pepperoni pizza. I will not touch with a 10-foot pole. The fourth one, though, is my favorite, which is bacon horseradish.
That sounds pretty good, actually.
Bacon horseradish dip and some Ruffles.
Bacon horseradish cream cheese on a bagel all of a sudden sounds really good.
And by the way, I will say for lunch, my son made me lunch yesterday, which was dino chicken nuggets and hash browns.
So yeah,
that's probably even a better answer. He stopped off on the way home from school. Was like, Dad, I'll take care of lunch. Dinosaur chicken nuggets and hash browns.
Yeah. So Chris, I played a bunch of pickleball recently. It's gotten kind of big in our area. It is a lot of fun and kind of low stress in that level. We've got the Hammonds boys with us too. I think recently, every once in a while, probably like every couple of months, Jill will make tater tots and chili tots as part of dinner. And so that's probably there's nothing healthy about that at all.
I said hash browns. It should be tater tots. I'm sorry. It was tater tots. Paul Hammond's. Sorry. I made hash browns last week for breakfast one day on the Blackstone griddle, which, by the way, that's good too.
Right. And Paul, specifically for you, the last time I had dino nuggets was in Jordan. And they do sometimes show up in the buffets in Israel for some reason. So you might be seeing some dino nuggets in the buffets in Israel.
Can I just tell you that the all-star of the processed nugget family that shows up on buffets in the weirdest place for me is the corn nugget.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the corn nugget. And there's a place like a Mexican place in Memphis that had corn nuggets, and you could go across the street to the Chinese buffet, and they had corn nuggets. And yeah, Schwann's sells corn nuggets. The corn nugget. Good stuff. Thanks for bringing up stuff from HEB, Hal, for those of us who don't live in Texas.
Yeah.
Rude.
Yeah, rude. Very, very rude. I could use a supply of creamed jalapeno soup and creamed poblano soup. Those are things that I like to try to keep around, but we're out.
That you cannot get here in the South.
Yeah. Maybe next time I get someone making a pilgrimage from Texas to Florida.
Maybe we should have Hal go buy us a case of each from HEB and ship them to us.
Yeah, I mean,
those are integral parts of our smoked queso, by the way.
I know. All right, so let's try to get back to our unplanned programming for the day, and nominal fee. That can be quite expensive. There was a lingering question from last week that we partially explored a bit of the textual side of things, but I wanted to bring it back up. And the question had to do with the application of Paul's statements in the letters that he writes to the church at Corinth with being all things to all men and how that relates to preaching. And I wanted to kind of branch the field out a little bit wider. One of the challenges that we've talked about before that's very specific, particularly to, it seems, younger guys, is trying to figure out what part of the church's communal needs need to be on their table. And like, what should they be holding on to? What should they be letting out? Because there's two ideas between being all things. One is in the in context use of the term and what Paul meant there. But then there's a more accommodative ways we use it. And we use that more accommodative concept in two areas. One is kind of fitting into the crowd in order to be evangelistic. And two, we also tend to use it like this unintentionally to create this context where the preacher is the source for all the things, or not necessarily the preacher. Maybe it's just one guy in a local church. And I think most people will acknowledge externally, if they're not in the middle of that blender, that it's not healthy. It's not really a great dynamic to have a single person be responsible for all or a majority of the things, whether it's Bible class teaching, preaching, whether it's leadership questions, scheduling. And I'll just give a really simple illustration. This was probably, I don't know, almost 15 to 20 years ago. I was invited to hold a gospel meeting at a congregation in Miami. My point of contact was a local preacher there. I put it on my calendar, put all those details down. You fast forward 3 years, meeting's coming up. It's going to be a year, about 9 months out. I reach out to that guy. He's moved from that local church. Get a contact for that local church. Meeting doesn't even exist on any of their records. It's not healthy. Like, I've got my schedule built in. I only do a certain number of meetings every year. That's just a one-off encounter. And others do the same thing. Like, this is kind of a normal scheduling issue concern with some places, but it should never be that one guy. Like, there should have been some level of divergence between each of these areas of responsibilities and then passed off when somebody moved. Hey, that guy's not here anymore, but here's all the context, here's all the information. That's just an illustration. I want to suggest that I think that problem creates what we might consider a unintentional diatrophies that everyone sees okay with. Diatrophies is presented to us in a negative light in the New Testament for a number of reasons. But if we make our own and everyone's happy with it, and maybe that's a really great guy and he's not engaged in malfeasance, it's still a problem. It's still a point of failure, like Bob points out, where, hey, what's going to happen if it's something more significant? Because a meeting being forgotten isn't a big deal in the big cycle of things. What could be a big deal is any number of other important intercongregational relationship matters that get lost because one guy was the guy. Terry, I've talked too much. It's your time to talk about things.
Well, I mean, I think one of the problems here too is that we're very comfortable just in life in general having somebody else do something. And in churches, what happens is when things need to be done, it's really easy to lean on the guy who, for lack of a term, is the one employee. So we can kind of be like, well, you do all the things. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but something like plumbing or the yard needing mowed or something comes up and somebody goes, like, well, that's in your contract. I don't know if you've ever had anybody joke around with you, and it's a joke because it's not in our contract, obviously, but there's also like a hidden truth to that a little bit, where we have this one guy, so we become the guy that gets the mail and answers the phones and writes all the letters and deals with the copier contracts and the plumbers and the roofers, and any other issues that come up? Well, because we have time and we're there and we're, and that's the reasoning that's used. And then, oh, by the way, you're also in charge of the teaching, you're in charge of the preaching, you're in charge of the evangelism, which means largely you're just going to do all those things, is what ends up happening. And it's an unintentional diatrophies, because the reality is, I don't know, I'm sure there's exceptions to this, Phil, but I don't know many preachers that want to do all those things. Like, that's a load. I mean, I think it's even worse with I think there's two levels of this, by the way, and maybe you see this too. One level is almost universally preachers are expected to be the main Bible class teacher, the main preacher, and the main evangelist. When you don't have elders and deacons, then what gets tossed on top of all of that is all the other stuff, the administrative stuff, because you don't have any of those guys to handle any of that stuff either. So then you get all the counseling, which sometimes happens anyway with elders, but you get all the counseling, you get all of the random meetings with third-party services that have to be done, whether it's the copier guy, the roof guy, the plumber. You get all the things added to you when there's no elders, because you become the de facto pastor, even though we say there is no such thing, who has to control all the things.
And this is where the hook gets in, because there is a fear of dismissal inherent to preacher-church relationships, where I've seen this, and I've also sensed it internally for myself and others. Like, well, what happens if I don't do this? What happens if I let this go? What happens if somebody else does this?
What happens if I say no?
Yeah.
Like, what happens if I go, no, I'm not meeting with the plumber? Somebody else is going to have to do that.
Right.
What do you mean you're not meeting with the plumber?
Right. And there's like different variations on how we, like, once we've been hooked, into that thing, it's really hard to let it go. There's an older evangelist, great guy. He was getting towards the middle phase of his work. He had started serving as an elder for that local church. And he really actually thrived on that time spent mowing the lot around the building. Like, he really enjoyed that. The deacons, though, one of them being one of his kids, came to him and said, hey, we really feel like this is our area. And so they had like a little internal fight over taking the keys away from the mower, because he was so invested in that process. Like, he really loved doing that singular task. And his son eventually said, Dad, this is our job. We need to do it because it's our job. And you think about, like, why would you not, like, let that go? And, like, but that's how we are with a lot of things in life. Like, there's a point where it's actually detrimental to continue to do a thing that's not your thing, even if you're good at it, even if you're at the best at it. Like, there's a time to let that go. And I think for preachers early on, we may not necessarily get mentored in a way to help us navigate some of those choices in a positive direction. Chris talks about day one, last guy tended the shrubbery and the plants around the building. And Chris's answer is so.
But here's the thing about that. When Chris moved there, Chris was experienced. He had done this for a while. But 23-year-old Chris moves there, and that said, and he feels pressure, he probably has a different response.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that happens when you start preaching out young is, for a lot of, and I don't know if this is true about you, Phil, for me, there's no elders, there's no deacons in my first two works. What happens is all the stuff that has to be done, somebody has to do it. You have more time because you don't have a 40-hour-a-week secular job. You're available during the day. And even though the retired guy a block down the road could take care of it, he's not volunteering. You stepped up to do it. Well, then honestly, after 10 years of that, you're conditioned to think all of those things are part of your job.
Yeah.
Because you've done them, like you said, out of job security, and also out of just like, I just want to get it done. Yeah. I don't want to wait 4 months for some guy to take care of this copier issue. I can just get it done. So that's the thing is you get conditioned to think, well, this is just part of preaching.
Yeah.
And this is just part of the job.
Here's the way, and we justify it in our heads. We talk about, like, Chris talks about the preacher taxi service. If you own a truck and you're a preacher, you're the preacher moving service. We justify it telling ourselves, well, this is a chance for me to interact with the members here and engage in encouragement, edification, get to know one another. And there's a place for that. Yeah. The problem is that in that leadership space of the preacher and the perception of your schedule, that you're just completely available, everything can end up on your table. And it's important, it's actually imperative to create a life balance as a leader in that preaching space that lets you do those things, but doesn't take over the place of the main thing. Because it's absolutely important for you to be engaged in the lives of the local church, to be present for any number of things, and even to incidentally be the guy who's at the building that opens the door for the plumbers. Like, that may be an incidental need that week, but it also may be better to have someone who can be there with that big plumbing issue and handle the project. And yeah, that's not you, because you've got something to do that is of equal importance for the communal need of the church. And there's different ways to solve that. And I want to talk on something that I probably will get Chris excited because I know this is something he's passionate about. You take the role of Bible class teaching and preaching, and you realize that one of the expectation is that you mentor others into that process. That should be taking place on a regular basis in local churches. And you need to find a way in which you can include that into your work, because as a net benefit, the net benefit is the church is better with more than one voice. Your schedule gets adjusted. That's something that I think is really valuable, is to say, no, actually, what I need to be doing is teaching 2 people to do this job so that we have 3 people doing this job, even if those 2 people don't intend to drive a living from it, that they want to be what sometimes referred to as bivocational. Well, that means there's somebody ready to preach when you go on short notice because there's a family emergency, or even on a vacation, you've got someone who's excited and is like prepared. I got a sermon ready. I'm good to go. Like, I want to do this. Okay, we're going to have you do it this time. Like, there's some balance there that needs to be shifted. That's different from the intern relationship we've talked about before. This is internal in-house growth.
The thing that I always come back to on some of this is that Ephesians 4 says that one of our tasks, that is actually a task given to us, is to equip the saints to do the work. And if we're doing all the work, whether it's the spiritual work or the administrative work, which is still part of the work, but if we're doing all of the work, then we're actually failing in our task to help equip the members to do part of the work and part of the ministry. I think for years we've kind of kicked back on that title minister, because ultimately we're supposed to help everybody grow into the role of ministering, period. Ministering to each other, ministering to the lost. And the problem here is that when you become the paid supported preacher, you take on a lot of those roles to the extent of all of a sudden, you're not training anybody. They're just showing up to church. You're not equipping anybody because you're doing everything. It's actually a detriment to the church when you do this. Now, one of the challenges of that, Phil, we talked about earlier and stuff, is sometimes church leadership doesn't understand that's really the role.
Well, I think Edwin makes a useful point to connect here. He talks about how there was discussion at a particular place about this role, and there was a lot of conversation about things, including even who's going to cut the grass around the building, around the parsonage. And I think that's a thing where people in those discussions, especially when there's no elders, but even when there are elders, we default to what we know and we know this task needs to be done, and we know that that's part of this process, and we all want to say our piece and like say this is something that's important to me. And so I think to a certain degree, there is a need to bring those individuals who are motivated to talk about these secondary issues to a table that says, here's what's important for the local church, and you are too. And this need you're talking about is important too. But is this preacher here the guy that needs to be doing that thing? Maybe we need to reallocate and like get him like as a participant rather than as a criticism of things. I think that's part of this process. It's not just about the preacher saying no. It's about the preacher saying that's important, but it needs to be over here. And so that we can prioritize this stuff a little bit better.
So my first work was kind of a rural place, and it was interesting. Edwin, the question you just asked is Ephesians 4 and 2 Timothy 2. My first work was a rural place, and to print the bulletin, it was a 35 to 40 minute drive to go to Office Depot to print roughly 55 pages of a bulletin and drive back. And so I go to the congregation and I say, we need a copier. And they kicked back on that. No elders. It was a 3-month process to get a copier. But one of the things I had to ask them was, is the best use of my time a 2-hour round trip to get these pages copied a week?
Yeah.
Is that the best use of my time to reach out and to do the work that but that God wants me to do? And I think it's interesting sometimes we don't put that in that context. As the preacher, sometimes you have to make the call that one thing that is spiritual in nature is more important than mowing the grass. And that kind of speaks to what Edwin's talking about. Look, as your job is not to take care of all the tasks around the building. That's not what they hired. They could hire a janitor or a facilities manager for that. I think that's important. And I want to answer Emerson's question, which I think is interesting. You know, a lot of smaller works aren't interested in this concept of equipping, and they just want a feeder, not a trainer. And his question was, should we advise men to go there, do the best, or to not go there, starve those churches out of their consumer mindset? My answer is simply this. I think those churches need older men who are willing to go there to show them a better path. But what happens is younger guys go to those congregations is what happens. And they get trained like I did and like you did and kind of swallowed up and kind of trained into this way to this. Well, this is just how you're supposed to be. And we just need some more wisdom to go to those places. And if the wisdom can't go to those places, then we probably do need to let them kind of struggle a little bit. I don't know if close the doors is always good, but
yeah, that's a difficult thing. And so I'll talk about it both personally and then like what my practice is in the advisory role when asked. Like if people ask my opinion, like should I go to a certain place or should I not? I try not to be in that spot too much. But years ago, I was discussing with a congregation. It has some wonderful people in it, but the group was very divided. There was 2 factions in that local church, and they were trying to agree on a person who didn't actually exist in the world. There's no way that they would be satisfied with any one person. And the general advice to me as a young person was to be very careful about going to a group like that because it was going to be constant turmoil. Like you would get ground to bits in that setting. And so I think there's a certain degree of Chris's comment that is valid in that there are some works that are not great fits for certain people. There are 2 problems with figuring that out, though. If I'm offering my advice, there's a lot I don't know. I don't know actually the local work. And even when I do, I don't necessarily know the man as well as I could otherwise. And even if I know those 2 things, I don't know necessarily what's in the heart of that man and that local group at that time, if they're great. That's why my general advice is you guys should talk a lot. You guys should really sit down and have a great conversation about what your perceptions are. And then if someone came to me and said, hey, this is what they said the work needs to be, you're going to be doing all these other things, I'd be like, that's a lot. And that's not really the work that is the preacher's work. And here's the negative consequences to it. You may want to go back and talk to them and see if you're the right fit for that expectation, or maybe they need to reframe their priorities. To the point of starving them out, I think God is going to do that on his own.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to intentionally get into that space. Edwin talked about it a few years back in some context, maybe on one of our broadcasts or something, that God gives the increase. The balance is God also gives the decrease. If you want to see the application of it. And I think to a certain degree, those are biblical outcomes that are causal. Like, here's a cause, here's a problem. It's going to get drastically different.
Right.
Which leads to this last thing. The preacher's work is kingdom space work applied in a local setting. And so I don't think there's any problem with a man who does good work being satisfied with continuing to do good work with a particular local church. I also don't think there's any problem with a guy who does good work, who's in a good situation, hearing that there's a field that's needed. Like, there's a guy that preaches down in Florida right now that's decided he's leaving a good, healthy work where he's rewarded, cared for, but he's going to go preach overseas because he sees a difficult field that he feels he is uniquely qualified to be a laborer in. I think that's awesome, and so there's nothing negative about that, that he's making that choice. And it's a great choice, probably also a hard one. And so I think there's a lot of it that's important there.
Well, I think it's also fair to say you kind of see both in the scriptures, right? I mean, to a degree, Paul and Barnabas could have stayed in Antioch. Of course, they didn't have a choice, but I'm just saying long term, they could have stayed in Antioch and been very comfortable. But they were sent, and what you see is them staying some places longer than others, but a lot of times it was need based. Whereas you have Peter, and there was a need in Jerusalem, who it appears just stays in Jerusalem. I mean, you've got a little bit of both in the scripture. I don't think there's one way or one wrong way. I think one of the things that comes to mind with what you said earlier about you need to talk a lot is, and I know we've done things about this before, the traditional come try out model to decide if you're going to work with a church is probably a broken model today. There needs to be a lot more discussion, communication than what can happen on one Sunday by you preaching and then having a 30-minute business meeting following your one sermon. I think, when I started preaching, Phil, and when you did, that's how it was done. I mean, you went and you tried out and you had a brief conversation, and then you would wait to hear back. And maybe you would hear back in a week or two, and that was it. There was not a lot of conversation. There's got to be a lot more conversation. What are the expectations? What things do we expect of each other? Questions should be asked back and forth. And you need to leave that satisfied. I'll never forget talking to one church that were interested, and I was interested. We had history together. We knew each other pretty well. But they wanted it to just be a formality. And I had lots of questions because I knew lots of things. And 3 hours later, I think I had worn them out. And I had also decided this is not for me. This place is not for me. You've got to do your homework and all of that. So you don't, like Edwin talked about earlier, you don't show up and they give you the keys to the lawnmower. Or they say, oh, by the way, this guy did the bushes. That's part of your job too. A lot of conversation has to go into all of this. A lot of conversation.
Yeah, there's a group that in the process of our conversation phase that was very long, they realized they weren't, like, I was there discussing the possibility of moving to work with them, had preached for them that day. In the process of that long conversation that's connected to all of that, they realized they weren't ready for a guy to come there just yet. And it wasn't, I'm not the right fit. It was them realizing, hey, we're not ready.
Correct.
Because we have to internally figure out some things for us before we bring in this third party guy. That's actually a healthy outcome. Like, there's nothing negative about that. To realize, hey, no, it's not the right time for anybody.
There's
Even though I
nothing
thought I would have
negative
done
about
good work there.
yeah. There's nothing negative about figuring out that you should not go to a place.
Right. And they figured out that they shouldn't have anybody come independent
Correct.
of me. And they eventually did. And the guy seems to be fitting in really well, and the group seems to be, making some good progress. So again, thinking about this, and Edwin's making one last key point. The balance of this is also recognizing that these are not problems that get solved in a 1 hour conversation, or we're going to have a business meeting today and we're going to fix all of this. Business meetings are a part of a process in any entity, church or local church's business, but they are process things, or you may have a year of preaching and teaching on a subject, 10 separate meetings, and we get frustrated because it takes us a year to do that. You're not taking a year to write up a new plan of action. You're taking a year to develop a heart to a new dynamic that may have been closed off in the past because someone heard it 20 years ago, and you're pumping life back into it again where it had been closed off. And so that brokenness that we might see right away, we're seeing a symptom before we've diagnostically figured out what the cause was, and then applying whatever solution is necessary at the end.
We also see things work elsewhere and think, well, that will be easy to implement quickly. And don't realize the amount of time it took at that other location to do that. I'll never forget. I think Edwin was there too, and I can't remember who asked the question. It might have been Edwin. It was to Max Dawson. His Kingdom Leaders book had just come out, and everybody looked at Dallin Road and their shepherds and what was talked about there. We're like, man, I want to do that. We do. So everybody was doing the Kingdom Leaders book, and then after 3 months of the Kingdom Leaders book, they're like, why aren't we like Dallin Road with our shepherds? And so that came up in a private kind of closed call with Max Dawson, and Max is like, guys, it took over 25 years for us to get to there. Like this was a long process. I think sometimes we look at these barriers and we think, well, if I recognize a barrier, I'll just tear it down and it'll be done. And it doesn't work that way. Sometimes it takes years to overcome an obstacle and a lot of patience.
And that's okay. That's part of the balance. Just like, it's okay if a guy goes there, and even a young guy may actually be the better choice in some settings because of their unique connection to the area, their experiences, their skills, their ability to even be there.
Right.
All of those things are hard to quantify. And the candlestick application of it is one of those unknowns. Like,
right. How will we know that?
And I really all add this. I don't think it's probably the most theologically wise approach to talk about another church's candlestick in a first person kind of like, I can see it, I can know thing. Because even in places where the candlestick is still present in that pictorial realm in Revelation, there are a lot of messes that everybody in this particular chat right now would be like, I wouldn't be part of that group. Like, right. I would drive across the county before I'd be part of that group.
I know we're out of time, but I do want to just highlight what McPherson says, which is a really strong point that ties to a lot of this, is the difference between working with and working for. The difference between being an employee and being somebody who's supported to work in the work. That is a cultural problem we have in our churches. It's one we've talked about before. It's one that's not easily fixed, but it's one we need to be aware of and we need to be trying to change, because it really does tie to a lot of the stuff we said. And it starts, by the way, the problem with the 23-year-old Terry Francis, why he was willing to do everything, is because he had a work for mindset and wanted the job security, so he made sure everything got done.
Yeah.
That's a big change. That's a big challenge to overcome.
Right. And, Chris's last little quick comment, I'll just address real fast. And there's absolutely communities of Christians that are really placing unfair weights around preachers. And it's completely fine to say, hey, man, you need to talk to these 8 people who have been here in the last 8 years and see if that's where you want to go. That first person contact is far better than the reputation side for a local church. Flipping it around, preachers have a reputation too. And some problems are not the local church, they are the preacher, positively and negatively.
Yeah, I heard of a church one time that was upset with their current preacher because the preacher they had before him was always at the office at 4:00 a.m.
Yeah.
Okay. It's kind of like the trimming of the bushes, right? But you had one preacher that came in and set a different standard than the next guy, and that was looked down upon. I mean, there's two sides to that. That goes back to the interview process, lots of communication, lots of questions, not just with the church and the preacher involved, but with other people who've preached there before. I think that's really radically important in that case.
Yeah. There's a great guy that I know that does done really good work. Would get to the building super early, but he also had a cot in the office. You know, and does that mean he's lazy? No, it means he was at the building like at dark 30 and then did all of his other stuff and just on a different schedule. Like,
by the way, this chair is really comfortable.
Yeah, I don't know.
I bet that couch behind you is pretty comfortable. Of course, your office is like in the same spot as your bedroom, so
right. Like I have no door to the house, and so the home office thing is a thing.
Yeah.
To be fair, I don't actually fit on that couch. It's about 6 inches too short, so it kind of eliminates that need.
Humble brag about our height today. We'll close with that.
Whatever, little man. Whatever, little one.
Yeah, little man. You're the first person to call me that.
Hey, it is what it is. Hey, everybody. Hopefully this has been an engaging conversation, something to think about. For those who do not actively preach and you're just, curious about preacher work, Shane, I don't know how to couches too.
Just go. Just. There's no recovery.
There's things I want to say, but I'm not going to say.
No, there's just close it out. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining. Have a great day. We'll see you next week.